I give them it.
Down here, down here.
You're big.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for coming to the 6th annual Ottilia Chareka Memorial Lecture on Education and Social Justice. I'm Alan Sears, and I teach here in the Faculty of Education. Kind of long in the tooth, but still hanging in. And I have the great pleasure tonight of introducing you to two women who've been very important in my life. The first one is Ottilia, in whose memory we meet. Ottilia grew up in Zimbabwe, and she was the first woman from her village to go on to university, the first one to get a PhD. When Ottilia was in elementary school in the middle of the Zimbabwean War of Independence, and can remember having to lie on the floor of her classroom while soldiers from either side in that war fired bullets through the windows at each other. So she didn't have an easy time. She finished school and primary school, and her father told her that he was going to use the family money to educate the boys in the family, not the girls. And so she had to earn her own money to pay her own way to secondary school, which she did. And then she went to teachers college and became a teacher, and came here in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to be as a spouse of a man who was coming to do a PhD in mathematics and statistics. And so they had one baby when they arrived, and two when they went back to Zimbabwe. But in the interim, Ottilia decided that she needed to upgrade her education as well, but no one was sponsoring her. So she went to work as a maid at the Lord Beaverbrook Hotel to earn money, to pay her own way, and earned a diploma in advanced undergraduate studies in education in the spring of 1991. 1993, in the spring of 1993, just as I was arriving home from working on my own PhD at UBC. And I walked in and met Ottilia for the first time, and she said, "Oh, I've heard about you. You're going to supervise my master's degree." And that pretty much defined my relationship with Ottilia. I did supervise her master's degree, and she went home to Zimbabwe, and we had a great time. She went home to Zimbabwe. In fact, just before she went home, we had a party at Joan Savoy's house. Joan was a teacher in the district and was in the master's cohort with Ottilia, and Joan's here tonight to hear the talk. So we're really glad that she's here. We had a party and sent Ottilia off, and I never expected to see her again. And that was true until the winter of 1999. And I walked into the graduate office one day, and she was sitting there. And I said, "Oh, cool, Ottilia, what are you doing here?" She said, "I came back so you could supervise my PhD." And so I did. And Ottilia was passionate about social justice and about the power of education to bring justice to women. to indigenous peoples, to people who were in minority groups and marginalized. And she finished her PhD here and took up a position as an assistant and then associate professor at St. Francis Xavier University, and was making a huge impact at St. Yvette's when she was murdered 6 years ago last March. And that was a devastating day for all of us. It was a devastating time for all of us in the Faculty of Education. And this lecture series is one way for us to carry on her memory. And the woman coming tonight was a friend of, I know her well. In fact, we had a really interesting time at one conference I went to because Ottilia used to call me her academic dad. So we went to one conference and she was speaking and I was sitting on the side and she said, "There's my father over there." And everybody kind of looked a little bit strangely at me and I said, "Yeah, my other daughter's at the back right over there." So it was Rebekah, but they were close. Ottilia was a mentor for Rebekah. I want to tell you a little bit about Rebekah. I know lots about Rebekah. I was debating whether or not to say any of the embarrassing things I know about Rebekah. But I want to begin. This is a Faculty of Education, and the purpose of our talks, always our public talks, are to engage people in deep public discussion of education. And I want to say to the educators here tonight, if you don't think you make a difference, you're wrong. Because Rebekah's here tonight because a number of educators made a profound difference in her life, and she can tell you about some of them. But they introduced her to some of the ideas that she's going to talk about tonight. Some of those educators are in the audience, and I'm not going to call them out because I'm afraid I'll miss some because there are so many. But I do want to mention Rebekah's grade 2 teacher. Was grade 2, right? Grade 3?
Yes.
Grade 3 teacher in Vancouver, who introduced Rebekah to the story of Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes. And if you know anything about that story, it's from Japan, you know that Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, and she lived about a mile from ground zero. She survived. She and her family survived that, but 10 years later, in the mid-1950s, she was diagnosed with cancer, probably as a result of her exposure to radiation on that day and following. Sadako's friends encouraged her to make 1,000 origami paper cranes. There's a legend in Japan that if you make 1,000 paper cranes, the gods will grant you a wish, and her wish was to live. Sadako didn't live. She did make 1,000 paper cranes. In the book, she doesn't, but her family insisted she did. In fact, made more than that. But after she died, her friends raised money to put up a statue which stands at Memorial Park in Hiroshima, the park where the dome is. You've probably seen pictures of it if you haven't traveled to Japan. And at the foot of the statue is a plaque that reads, "This is our cry, this is our prayer, peace on earth." So Sadako was one of the influences in Rebekah's life that turned her heart toward peacemaking. Others included Ruby Bridges, the young girl who was the first young child to go, African-American child to attend an integrated school, or she integrated schools in New Orleans. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others. It was a group of students from this faculty actually that went out when she was in middle school to do an enrichment unit on the Holocaust that also was one of the seminal events informing her interest in human rights and social justice and the pursuit of peace. On finishing at Leo Hayes High School, which Rebekah will tell you is the high school. At finishing at Leo Hayes High School, Rebekah came here to UNB and did a degree in history. She was in the first cohort of Howard Douglas Scholars, which is an honor society we have at UNB for people who do exactly this, combine high academic standings with a concern for the community and civic engagement. She went on from there. She spent a year in Rwanda working for an African NGO, and particularly on issues of reconciliation around the genocide that had occurred there 10 years before she went. And then she came home and pursued a master's degree in peace and conflict resolution in the international studies at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And then has had a series of jobs working for an NGO, first in Ottawa, and then the Mennonite Central Committee in Winnipeg, and traveled with MCC to Colombia, where she worked for 3 years, particularly on issues around land rights. So if you have investments in Canadian mining companies, Rebekah can tell you why that's not a good idea. She worked in Colombia, and then she came back 3.5 years ago to take up her position as a policy advisor in MCC's office in Ottawa. She travels extensively with MCC, and we're going to meet some of the people that she meets on her travels tonight. So, Rebekah. I have to tell you this, I forgot this. This was a result of Rebekah reading Sudan about paper cranes. We have paper cranes all over our house. We have had since she was about 8. It's like when they put confetti in your car when you get married. You never quite figure out where it all is.
Well, that's the only thing I know how to make. I do have to acknowledge, I am very appreciative of all the FHS folks that are here tonight. Don't take personally my Lions bias, but we were the first graduating class, so it comes that way. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm incredibly honored to be here tonight. I want to thank Kathy for the invitation and the committee for inviting me to speak here tonight. Words cannot express my feeling of getting this invitation to honor such a wonderful woman, a scholar, an activist, and to share some of the work that we do with Mennonite Central Committee. And you can read more about MCC on our website, but and also our social media and our blogs and other forums. But just as a way of brief introduction, MCC has been around for almost 100 years, working in areas of relief, development, and peace with local partners and in local organizations in over 50 countries around the world. So in our Ottawa office, which is just about 40 years old, we're small, but very vocal. So our mission is to speak to the Canadian government, to policymakers, and to Canadians about impacts of Canadian policy on our partners around the world. So we take our kind of a lead from our partners and telling us what's going on in their different countries. So I've been with MCC for almost 7 years. So starting again in Winnipeg and then to Bogota, Colombia, and now to Ottawa. So I'll be sharing little bits and pieces about MCC as I explore this topic of women peace builders tonight. And so I invite you to explore that work further as well. So I want to dedicate this talk tonight to 2 women. First to the late and greatly missed Anne Sherman. So Anne Sherman was a leader and a friend to many here tonight, a friend to my family. It was Anne that first hired Ottilia, I believe, or she was involved in that hiring at St. FX. And seeing the incredible gifts and experience that Ottilia brought to the table, my father informed me that it was Anne who had suggested getting a practitioner for this year's lecture. My first reaction was, well, I don't have a PhD, I'm not a professor, and all the others had been. So, but it was Anne's insistence in getting a practitioner this year, working in the area of human rights education and social justice. And so I'm really honored that it's me. And back to the women of the night, Ottilia. I first met Ottilia through my father. Last year when he gave the lecture, he talked about Ottilia being a force to be reckoned with as his former student, but also a natural leader coming into our lives and becoming fast friends with our family. Ottilia had become a mentor to me in my career as I started to develop and work in different areas of peace building and human rights. And so my first job after my undergrad here at UMB was in Rwanda, working with an NGO of peace and reconciliation. So she was my guide through the more comical kind of culture shock issues from food to insects. She was quite jealous of some of the things I was able to eat. So this is the other side of Ottilia, the side that we all know and love. But also she was just helping me develop deep and meaningful relationships with my colleagues and the pursuits of justice and peace around the world. So in terms, I also want to put up this shot of in terms of narrowing down the topic for tonight, it was incredibly easy. Women peace builders from the grassroots to the tables and halls of power. So first on the work front, in the policy realm in Ottawa, you cannot escape the rhetoric of promoting and elevating the role of women as agents of change in the world. And part of our work is to ensure that this government rhetoric turns into action, something that we are watching very closely, especially as women continue to be excluded from high-level negotiating and decision-making tables around the world when it comes to peace. In our program-related work, our Ottawa office and across our system, we have done several projects in the last several years on women peace builders and the role these women have played within their communities, providing leadership, innovation, and courage. And tonight I'll introduce you to some of these women. Second, thinking back to Ottilia, based on her work, action, and her own experience, I know that she would have loved to meet and know these women. She herself was a leader and a trendsetter, not only in her work, but in her own life story, as we've heard, being the first woman in her clan to graduate high school, then go on to a master's and a PhD and become a professor. Ottilia was a woman of courage who spoke out against injustice and was a voice for peace, someone who inspired these same ideals in others. I don't want to dwell on the details, but those of you who know the story will know the tragic circumstances surrounding her death, her murder, and is a critical call to action to continue that work that Ottilia championed and continuing to speak up against injustice and to challenge our society and our own communities to be better. We mourn the incredible loss of Ottilia, but her legacy calls us to keep going and keep fighting for justice and peace for all. And with that, I dedicate tonight's talk to Ottilia, and I challenge myself and others to wholeheartedly embrace the call for justice and peace. I also dedicate it to Anne Sherman, her wonderful career, and love and passion for the people around her, including Ottilia, to keep this legacy going. So, in order to make the case for women peace builders, I'm going to provide a quick three-part outline of where I'll be taking you tonight. I will be talking a lot about peace building, but maybe just explain what I mean by peace building. So there is the kind of peace building we see at the negotiating table, like a mediating and negotiating kind of peace building. But then the definition of peace building goes far beyond that. So it covers multiple sectors across society. And for MCC's partners, for example, sometimes this means incorporating a social cohesion workshop into a material aid project, or introducing peace-building techniques to school children and the creation of peace clubs in schools. And I'll be talking about that in two of my examples. That train children and youth about conflict resolution techniques within their own families and schools, but also in kind of helping them develop this national perspective. The bringing together of trauma healing and reconciliation as a form of peace building under one umbrella. Building bridges by intentionally bringing people together from different ethnic, national, or religious groups. It's hard to capture really a snapshot of peace building in action, but often it comes under the umbrella of other programming. So integrating the work across society, and you'll see more what I mean when I get into some of the examples. But first, getting into the outline, I want to talk a little bit about data, and the main body of the talk will focus on the women working within communities at the grassroots level, taking the lead in peace-building projects. But first, I want to examine the role and place of women peace builders on the world stage. So I'll talk about how women have been involved, or rather excluded for a large part in this case, from national and global stages of high-stakes peace negotiating tables, and the missed opportunity of such exclusion. In addition, there's also more and more data and analysis available about women leading movements within civil society, so alongside formal peace talks. Peace building, as I mentioned earlier, is much more than sitting around a table, but being out in the communities and active and getting people involved. And so these negotiating tables play a significant role in mapping out a formal process, and women should be included in that process, but it's often civil society and communities that have to buy in and make the peace work in the years to come. So the bulk will be women peace builders from the ground up. This is a critical crossroads between a lot of the data analysis and policy directions and making the theoretical meet the practical, so putting a face to some of these theories. So when I work in MCC, we encourage come alongside partners to strengthen the work already being done along the ground. So our work basically is to lend our privilege as a megaphone to get these stories that are happening all over the world out there in a more broader sense. And so through that we want to challenge some of the dominant narratives that exist around there. So I want to introduce you to a sample of women peace builders that are taking leadership within their communities in the work of justice and peace, and sometimes in unexpected ways where you might not expect to have peace building, and whose influence is felt throughout their communities and across their countries. So we'll travel from the Atlantic coast of Colombia to Jos, Nigeria, from Rumbek in South Sudan to gathering of Palestinian and Israeli women in Nazareth to finally a farm on the West Bank. So, and finally, I'm a little worried about time, but we'll see how much time we have for this. But so thinking about what comes next, so looking at policy and advocacy and focusing and fostering change. So I want to conclude tonight with a little discussion about some of the women peace builders as a key issue within Canadian foreign policy. So Canada is in the process of renewing its Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan that's based on UN Resolution 1325, passed in 2000. And the 6 subsequent Security Council resolutions on this theme. So this has been really high up in the discussions in Canadian policy circles, and the need to have for participation of women and voices of women from the grassroots all the way up to the top in every stage of conflict, from prevention to resolution to relief and rehabilitation. So, and the current rhetoric of the Canadian government is speaking to these issues. So the recent release of the so-called Feminist International Assistance Policy, and it seems to open the door to this message. And so our role as advocates and Canadian citizens in general is to hold the government to account on this, and let's see you put these words into action. So, but just before we get started, I want to tackle a couple prominent myths. I'm aiming to be a little cheeky in this, so I hope it's a little fun. So I want to take a few minutes to challenge some of these myths and narratives that we hear about women and peace building. And I want to name them because I believe they're prominent in our understanding of the issues, whether we realize it or not. And we need to name them as a way to move forward. The rest of my talk will be framed around the idea that these misconceptions, or at least exaggerated stereotypes, are needed to be challenged. And just as a side note, I'm going to be dipping a little bit into gender roles, especially of men and women, sexism and misogyny, but this is not just meant to be sharing of some of my own observations, so I'm not an expert in this area. I'll leave that to the gender specialist, but as I want to spend the majority of the talk looking at the human faces and the women peace builders. So with that in mind, myth number 1. Women excel at peace building because they are naturally more peaceful, nurturing, meek, and mild than men. So I don't know how many of you know Ottilia, but that's not exactly what I think of Ottilia, or any of the other peace builders I've met. So, but behind this myth, I believe there is a strong patronizing and misogynistic undertone. This is not to say that women peace builders cannot and do not carry these qualities, but to assume that all women do, all while assuming that men do not possess any of these qualities, establishes, and I say, a false dichotomy. First, it not only assumes that there are different roles for men and women when it comes to conflict and engagement in conflict resolution, it suggests a kind of hierarchy in these roles. So the hard fields, the tough, the brave, the dangerous fields, the participation in armed conflict as combatants in a fight for freedom, peace, and justice is left to men. While on the other hand, women carry the soft actions of peace building, a heartwarming and beautiful field for prevention's sake and rebuilding after a conflict. So according to this narrative, not only are women too weak, meek, and mild to handle the hard actions, but the actions around peace building as a whole are presented as secondary to participation in armed conflict in terms of the importance when it comes to achieving a sustainable peace. So designations of bravery, courage, valor are saved for the hard fields. But what about the peace builders? Here, I might put in a bit of self-promotion. Tomorrow night, I'll be giving a lecture sponsored for the Gregg Study for the the Study of War and Society, Gregg Center, where I'll also be challenging what I see as a dominant narrative of military intervention and peace building in general, so of both men and women, and the dichotomy of hard and soft, primary and secondary responses to conflict. So you have to come tomorrow to hear that. That's at the Provincial Archives at 7. So, myth number 2. Women connections to armed conflict are primarily as victims of violence and terror. So yes, of course, we know that women are victims of conflict and violence. We can't escape that, especially in the context of this particular memorial lecture. It cuts really deep. We also know that as women, and armed conflicts have had as war and armed conflicts have more and more fought within communities instead of on the battlefields, especially since the aftermath of the Cold War. So moving away from the traditional battlefields. So today, non-combatants, including men, women, and children, are much more directly impacted by war. It's estimated that there are studies that upwards of 70% of the population directly impacted by war are women and children non-combatants. Not to mention the ever-increasing uptake of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war, which disproportionately impacts women and children while tearing the social norm, social fabric of families and communities apart. So, but however, to assume women are only ever victims when it comes to conflict does a disservice to women, especially women peace builders, and a disservice to conflict resolution and peace building efforts as a whole. The UN's mandate on women, peace, and security, specifically UN Security Council Resolution 1325, defines the roles and concerns of women in terms of conflict under four main pillars. So prevention, protection, participation, and relief and recovery. So Resolution 1325 not only addresses the specific concerns of women in terms of prevention, protection, relief, and recovery, but makes a case for the importance of participation of women in every stage of conflict, be it through prevention, mediation, resolution, and recovery. So I'll get more into the UN resolution later on. Wow, this one's a little fun. Myth 3. To add women and stir is a sufficient approach. So this is my favorite of the images of these myths and basis for argument, just because it's so cheap. But it is a warning against tokenism and bringing women to the table without there being opportunities and avenues for meaningful participation and active leadership, guidance, and decision making. We can't just add women and stir and say we've dealt with the issues of exclusion. We must ask, what is the nature, access, and quality of the participation? So, let's get into some of the numbers. So it seems quite obvious that women, making up at least half the population, and people arguably bearing the brunt and impacts of contemporary armed conflict, have as much at stake as any others in the work of peace. But in the diverse, high-level peace process around the world, the involvement of women is few and far between. In fact, a study by Maria O'Reilly with the International Peace Institute examining 30 to 40 major peace negotiations from 1992 to 2011 found that only 2% of chief mediators and 9% of negotiators were women. In Colombia's high-level peace talks between the government of Colombia and the largest guerrilla movement, the FARC, which ran from the fall of 2000 to mid-2016. I was there at the beginning. It was quite exciting. But it took over a year of talks before any women were brought to the high-level negotiating table in Havana, Cuba. Women were very active in the parallel movements in civil society back in Colombia, including several of MCC's partners in Colombia, and also presenting to the high-level talks. But despite women being the vast majority of victims of Colombia's 50-year civil war, especially when it came to displacement, and upwards of 40% of the FARC being young women, in addition to more than 20% of the ELN, another guerrilla group being women, it took over a year for women to be represented at the official negotiating tables. The fact is, not only do we see so few women at the table of peace negotiations, we also do not see specific women's concerns mentioned within treaty or peace accord documents. So according to a document from the U.S. Institute of Peace, of the 585 peace treaties negotiated over 2 decades, only 16% of them had any mention of specific roles and needs of women in the post-conflict environment. So Colombia's peace agreement, which was finalized in 2016, did, and maybe that's a sign of things to come. But sorry, where are we now? So in a report for the US-based think tank Inclusive Security, O'Reilly argues women can greatly influence prospect for peace when they are given official channels to peace negotiating tables. So she examined 40 peace processes in 35 countries over 3 decades and found that in particular negotiations that allowed for women to influence the process, all but one peace process ended with an agreement. And those agreements are then more likely to succeed. So an interesting example from the Canadian Parliament of the importance of women at these tables is from the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and international development. So until recently, until the fall committee shuffle, this of 2017, out of the 10 voting members of the standing committee, only one was a woman, NDP Foreign Affairs critic Hélène Laverdière. And as of September, there are 2 women out of the 10 voting members, including Ms. Laverdière and Anita Vanderbilt from the Liberals. It is 2017 after all. So last year, Hélène spoke at our annual MCC's Ottawa office student seminar on gender and peace building on the challenges of being the only woman at the table. She often felt like she had to constantly be pushing her ideas. For example, last year, when Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security expired, as I was mentioning earlier, it was Laverdière's pushing, not the chair, that caused the committee to take up a study on renewing this National Action Plan. So it was, and after the study was started, the chair and other members were quite enthusiastic about the idea, but it was until they actually started it, and she was the one pushing that. So that leaves us with the big question: why are we ignoring these voices and stifling the participation of women peace builders? So, I'm just noticing time. I will try to get through this section quickly, actually. So, just thinking about, there have been a lot of studies from looking at grassroots and civil society participation of women as well. So, in addition to the participation at the high-level negotiating tables. And so just to highlight that, so MCC Ottawa and our MCC office has been doing a lot of this work recently, but we are not alone in terms of civil society organizations. So we have Kairos Canada, for those of you who know Kairos, Oxfam, and Development and Peace, which is part of the Catholic Church in Canada, that have been doing very active campaigns in terms of highlighting the stories and of these women peace builders from around the world. So now for the fun part. This is the more enjoyable part. Let the journey begin from Colombia to Nigeria, South Sudan to Palestine and Israel. So Mampuhan, Colombia. This is easily one of my favorite case studies that I have for tonight, having worked in Colombia for almost 3 years. And during that time, I took several groups to come and visit Mampuhan on Colombia's Atlantic coast. We always enjoy the hospitality of the women weavers and quilters who have taken the country by storm through the telling of their story of trauma and violence, and finally restoration in a series of beautiful quilted tapestries. So just a brief background. So Colombia has recently entered the post-peace accord phase, an accord that was years in the making. For almost over 50 years, Colombia has been engulfed in internal conflicts, armed conflicts, and multiple complex and diverse actors and interests shifting from region to region, and claiming the lives of 300,000 people and displacing well over 7 million people, so over 10% of the population. So in 2000, the entire community of Mampuhan, which is located, you can see on the map, a small farming Afro-Colombian community on Colombia's Caribbean coast, was forcefully displaced by a paramilitary group. So after surrounding the community, armed paramilitaries searched the town and forced all citizens to come to the center of the town. There were allegations that turned out to be false, but the people of Mampuhan were collaborating with the FARC guerrillas. For hours, well into the night, the paramilitary members taunted the community, wielding machetes and other weapons, saying that they were going to massacre them. After all, in the Montes de Maria, the region of Colombia where they're coming from, there were massacres in the late 1990s and 2000s all over the region. So paramilitaries terrorized dozens of communities, carrying out massacres for seemingly no reason at all. So creating a real sense of fear throughout the region. But in the case of Mampuhan, at the 11th hour, a call came in from one of the paramilitary leaders proclaiming that this community was innocent. But in the interest of gaining territory, the whole community was still forced to leave their land almost immediately. Everybody was relocated with their clothes on their backs to an empty plot of land about 7 kilometers down the road. Needless to say, this series of events instilled trauma and fear within the population. After the displacement, Sembrando Paz, which means sowing peace, MCC's partner on the Atlantic coast, formed a relationship with the community. As a way to address some of the deep-seated trauma, Sembrando Paz, along with several women in the community, initiated a quilting project with the women of Mampuhan. The aim was to provide a space for the women to gather and to share about their trauma with other women in the community and open opportunities for healing and moving forward. The women began designing tapestries depicting, like the one you see up there, depicting their memories of the forced displacement. And it worked. As the women sewed and stitched together, they shared their stories and were able to find healing and resilience in the aftermath of fear and trauma. As a follow-up, the women quilters began talking about their experiences and trauma within the community at large, using the quilts as a teaching tool, a guide to the community's history and experience. And beyond the trauma, discussions rose within the group and the community as a whole around peace and justice, around calling on the government and local authorities to answer for what had happened and to begin a process of restoration. So as a result, and the end result, the quilting circle gained recognition on the national and international stage. But before we go there, let us take a moment to acknowledge and embrace the stereotype, at least what we would consider a stereotype in Canada. It's a quilting circle. For those of you who grew up and were active in a church, women's quilting circles are paramount to a healthy church community. But in this space, the women of Mapuhan thrived. So it became more than just that stereotype, in that they brought in all of these deep topics to that discussion table. Although I was talking with my mom a little bit about, and she was wondering, I wonder what the quilters at our church talk about when they're in that room. But they became leaders of their community and ambassadors of their history, and they took their show on the road to reach out to other communities who had been impacted by violence as well, and forced displacement. And as an aside, this is not the only sewing story that I have tonight. But let's get back to the story. So after the original quilts depicting the experience of the 2000 displacement, the women came up with the idea to share the story and the history of their entire community through the making of quilts from their ancestors arriving in Colombia on the slave ship from Africa, gaining their freedom and gaining Colombian citizenship, to the tragedy of 2000, and finally looking to the future, the fight for justice and dreams of a restored community. So these women, the quilters, became the gatekeepers of their community's history and legacy. Their work in part mobilized the community to fight for justice and restoration, one action being a march to the state capital, Cartagena, in 2011, over 4 days of marching. And to this day, Mapuhan is one of the only communities in Colombia to have received recognition from the Colombian government's peace and justice laws, land restored to their ownership and reparations paid. This was far beyond just the work of the quilters, but there was no doubt they were no doubt instrumental in this process. In addition, the women were invited to communities in the region and across the country who had also experienced trauma, sharing these quilts. So the entire quilt collection made a tour around the country and used as a tool by the government, actually. So in 2015, the quilters, formerly known as the Women Weavers of Dreams and Flavors, won a National Peace Prize for their efforts, and their collection of quilts, at least in part, was inducted into the National Museum in Bogota. So yet, as my colleague Anna, who works with MCC in Colombia and had worked in Mapuhan, living in Mapuhan for 2 years, she doesn't gloss over how hard this has been. It took years of pressure for Mapuhan to get recognition from the government. And in addition, although the land has been returned, the community continues to live in their displaced spot because the infrastructure has been totally deteriorated after 15 years of not being lived in. So the work continues, and we celebrate these prizes and these achievements, but we recognize that these women and the community have a lot of work to go. And so we stand with them as they continue that work in peace and justice. Now, before moving to the next example, I also need to put in a footnote here. So I know this example better than the others because it's one that I had visited several times. And so some of the challenges are visible for me. So another barrier for these women and their influence on the national stage has been pressures from home. So as the women excelled and became ambassadors for their community, this put intense pressure on their home lives. It sounds trite, but there was significant family tensions in Mapuhan, even among husbands and partners who were very active in the peace process alongside their wives. When the women would travel or be too busy hosting groups to take care of cooking in the household, this created a great bit of tension and in the home, and the women around the world when they become community leaders and activists. This is not uncommon. So these are challenges that women face when coming out of more traditional roles, and these challenges can raise tensions and also put women at intense risk. And so this ridicule and harm and within their families and communities. So I don't want to take away from this powerful story, but I just want to kind of highlight that this, in addition to all the other challenges that these women face, this is another one. So women peace builders need our support more than ever. So now we're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean to Nigeria, particularly Jos, located in the Plateau State. So Nigeria doesn't appear too much on Western media, save for the actions of Boko Haram and the tragic and inhumane abduction of about 300 girls a few years ago. So out of this dominant narrative emerges a seemingly endless conflict between Christian and Muslim Nigerians. So Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa, and 1/6 of the African population are Nigerians. So of the more than 350 ethnic groups, Nigeria's population is divided more or less 50-50 of Muslims and Christians. Christians primarily in the north, or Muslims primarily in the northeast and Christians in the south. So Plateau State, as you can see, is located in the middle of the country and is almost like a boundary of the predominantly Muslim north and predominantly Christian south. So Jos, being the capital of the Plateau State, has for years been the epicenter of violence between Christians and Muslims. And so the violence has been coming both ways. And I'm not saying that in a trite way. It actually is coming both ways. Oh, nobody gets my joke. So tensions, so it's this violence and carrying out and endless retaliations for said violence by Christians and by Muslims too. So tensions came to a head in 2001 with a series of violent attacks, followed by retaliations that rose up again in the years that followed. In 2004, 2008, 2010, so leaving hundreds of people dead after each outburst, and with tensions always rumbling under the surface. There's almost an invisible line in Jos separating Christians and Muslim neighborhoods, and neither the two would ever meet. So after an overnight flight from London and about 6 hours by car from Abuja, myself and 2 colleagues arrived last March in Jos to visit MCC's partners and staff in the region. And our first visit was a group of Muslim women from multiple organizations partnering with MCC on projects related to trauma healing for women in the city, as well as bridge building between Christians and Muslims. That's where we met Amina Ahmed. We've all heard stories about her from within the MCC community, one of the most energetic and dedicated peace builders in the Plateau State. She had long served as an advisor to MCC Partner Emergency Preparedness Response Team, a joint Christian and Muslim organization known throughout the state for responding to crises and addressing conflict at its roots. So EPRT also specializes in interreligious and ethnic peace building, its primary project being the initiation of peace clubs in schools in the area. So these are voluntary clubs established in dozens of schools across the region, working with children of all ages, learning to address and mediate conflicts, from the interpersonal level all the way to the national level. These clubs have had remarkable success in the Plateau State, bringing together Christians and Muslim students from all backgrounds. And Amina continues to support these clubs, as she has since about 2005. In addition, Amina, along with several others from Jos, both Christians and Muslims, sits on a planning committee, management committee for an institute of peace within Jos, aimed at bringing people from the city, region, and state together to talk about challenges, from political, social, economic, to building peace in times of tension and conflict. A few years ago, this center was just a dream, but in the last year, they've already held one session and are planning for another this year. So Amina and everyone on the planning committee are all alumni of the Africa Peace Institute, which is formerly in Zambia, now hosted in South Africa. API is an annual short-term education and peace-building program supported in part by MCC and aims to bring together people from across Africa, all ethnicities, languages, religions, and backgrounds, to address the obstacles to peace in all circumstances, and train its students to bridge building, leadership, and the work of peace. So Amina has become one of the strongest voices for peace across religious and ethnic divides among MCC's partners in Nigeria. But this was not always the case. Amina, as a young Muslim woman, recalls the decades of tensions intermixed with periods of acute violence. Well, she remembers losing her brother and several of her friends and neighbors in the 2001 uprisings. He was murdered by Christians. And so understandably, so utterly bitter and disdain for Christians within the community. And these same feelings were reciprocated among Christian neighbors, an almost complete atmosphere and pattern of dehumanization of the other. Amina had no interest in making peace with her neighbors, let alone getting to know them. The death of her brother led her to get involved with plans and strategies meant to target Christians in the communities around Jos. Her anger came from a place of fear as well, fearing that the Christians of Jos wanted nothing more than to eliminate their Muslim neighbors. However, 2 years later, Amina's heart and mind were open in a workshop when she came face to face with both Christian and Muslim neighbors, coming together in a spirit of unity and peace. For almost 20 years, MCC has been organizing interfaith dialogues and workshops and sessions for the people of Jos, trying to help people find common ground, to see someone once perceived as enemy, as a brother or sister, as a friend, also working for peace. Amina's heart was completely changed, and today she is one of the most powerful voices for peace and interreligious dialogue. Amina's work and that of other peace builders, both Christian and Muslim in Jos, has had incredible impacts on the community at large, spreading the message of peace. In 2014, following a deadly bomb attack in a crowded marketplace in Jos, attacks likely carried out by Boko Haram or a related group, something pretty incredible happened. Instead of an eruption of interreligious violence, Muslims and Christians came together, helping each other out of the rubble and coming together to rebuild. Former MCC national staffers in Jos described that as the moment they knew that peace had started to come to Jos. So, let's move across the continent to South Sudan, the world's newest country. So after being engulfed in almost 20 years of bloody civil war between the North and the South, South Sudan gained independence in 2011, only for brutal and complex internal conflict to again erupt in 2013. So often portrayed by the media as an ethnic conflict, South Sudan's civil war connects acutely to politics and power issues and constant shifting of alliances between groups, all coupled with a very heavily armed civilian population. So far, over 2 million people have been internally displaced by conflict. South Sudanese are the largest growing group of refugees in the world today, mostly going into Uganda and Ethiopia. While all sides have been accused of gross human rights violations and attacks against civilians across the country. Okay, so reports from the United Nations and other groups describe the horrific sexual violence committed specifically against women and girls. Yet women and girls are more often than not, excluded from the high-level peace talks in South Sudan. But even beyond this armed conflict that we hear about in the news and the sexual violence and challenges for girls, the community-level challenges are many as well. So in March 2016, as part of a small delegation from MCC offices in North America, I was able to visit programs and partners in South Sudan. And in the town of Rumbek, northwest of Juba, as we see there, we talked extensively about these kinds of challenges. So girls are an incredibly vulnerable and at-risk population in South Sudan. So one of the biggest challenges facing girls, in addition to the armed conflict, is early and forced marriage. Girls as young as 12 or 13 are forced into marriages, often with pressure from family members, especially uncles and other male relatives. So in this region of South Sudan, cattle farming is central to the local economy and practice, and it's included in marriage dowries. So when a young man wants to get married, he often has to borrow cattle from his older brothers and uncles to pay the bride price. Once the young man and his wife begin to have daughters of their own, his older brothers may apply intense pressure and even physical force, kidnapping girls from their parents' houses to have their daughters marry as soon as possible in order to regain the cattle price. So in addition, most families' education for boys is highly favored over education for girls. The girls who actually start primary school are much less likely to finish, let alone start secondary school. In some regions, girls are more likely to die while giving birth than finish school. Many are forced to drop out due to early marriage, or their brothers are given preference over the costs of school fees in secondary school. In a context where education as a whole makes up less than 1% of the national budget, these factors only further hinder girls from shaping their own futures and lives. So, in a bold move, over 10 years ago, the council and chiefs and leaders in the Rebekah area expressed a strong desire to develop a secondary school for girls. An Irish organization, Loretto, was invited to begin working with community leaders to help develop the Loretto Girls Secondary School, and MCC has since joined to support this initiative. So starting off small, Loretto has quickly become a very highly sought after program for girls across the country. Last year, over 200 girls had applied for about 65 to 70 open spaces, which are awarded based on academic ability, regional diversity, and level of risk facing applicants. The school also serves as a safe space for girls and young women. So girls who feel they are in danger of a forced marriage or their home region is caught up in violence are permitted to remain on campus year-round rather than return home for 3 months when the school is not in session. So it is a boarding school. And the school also emphasizes opportunities, encouraging students to dream big and think about their future. MCC supports after-school clubs in science, engineering, and technology, where students experiment with various technologies such as computer, tablets, and while working to improve math and science skills. But what I want to focus on are the incorporation of peace clubs, which have the same kind of format that I mentioned in Nigeria, which have become a key element of the school curriculum, providing a safe space for students to deal with personal issues as well as learn conflict resolution skills that can be applied in their relationships with other students as well as families and communities. So participation in peace clubs also gives students and anyone interacting with them to be it teachers, friends, or family, a vision for achieving peace in their country. So through the teachings and practices from these peace clubs and seeing intercommunal violence all around, the Loretto students long to promote the ideas of peace building beyond their classroom and into the surrounding communities. So the students initiated community-based trauma healing reconciliation groups called listening circles. These circles aim to bring people together from across the community, so men, women, and children, young adults, and adults with 2 to 3 facilitators from the school, and create a safe space for people to share traumas, grievances, concerns, and challenges. And through this fostering a spirit of peace within their community and country, my colleague Candesia, who works directly with these clubs in Rebekah, describes the young women leaders with the metaphor, the weak made strong, meaning that a population that faces more risk and marginalization than any others in the community are becoming leaders for peace in their community and country. She goes on to say that these young women are a source of hope for South Sudan and a reason to hope in South Sudan. So finally, our last stop the night will take us to Palestine and Israel, specifically to a church basement in Nazareth, and then to a farm near Bethlehem in a section known as Area C of the West Bank. There is no way to summarize the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in just a few sentences, so I'll try to focus on this one church basement group and this one farm and a farmer, Amal, and her brothers and sisters. So just this past May, I was able to go and had an incredible opportunity to visit our partners in Palestine and Israel, meeting with both Palestinians and Israelis, Christians, Muslims, and Jews who were working for a just peace. So the political situation strives of endless and hopelessness, and so we have no choice but to find hope in the stories of people working tirelessly for a sustainable and just peace through small actions and daily acts of resistance. So as this trip is fresh on my mind, I found it difficult to choose one story, so I managed to narrow it down to 2. So I'll briefly share one of them and spend a little more time on the other. So the first is a sewing project in Nazareth, which is located in Israel proper and not the occupied territories. There, Violette, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, has formed a small group of women, Christian and Muslim, and together they are learning and discovering the ancient sewing and needlework crafts of the Nazareth region that have been around for centuries. See, I told you I had another sewing example. So Violet is part of a partner called Sabil, which in Arabic means the way. It's an ecumenical group of Palestinian churches working to promote justice through education, theological training, and advocacy. So Violet's project in Nazareth aims to bring Muslims and Christian women together under the common heritage as Palestinians and reclaim a distorted historical narrative that states the land of Israel was empty swampland before the 19th century. Palestinian citizens of Israel make up 20%, or Arab Israelis, as you might hear on the news, make up 20% of the population of Israel proper. And many of these women can trace their family roots back generations in this region. Although full citizens, Violet described how Palestinian citizens of Israel face continued state-sponsored discrimination in terms of national laws that override citizenship laws, restricting specific professions, access to land in terms of buying property, and state neglect when it comes to infrastructure and access to good education, clean drinking water, and other essential services in predominantly Palestinian cities and neighborhoods. In reclaiming these ancient techniques, Violet hopes to bring unity between Christians and Muslims of Nazareth, all claiming Palestinian heritage, and also to reclaim the history of the Palestinian people in the region. There is a denial of us being a people, she says, and having a heritage, but we do exist. We do have roots. We are here. But now, onto the farm on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the West Bank, where we can find the Nasser family, where for over 100 years the family has been farming fruit and olive trees on the hilltop. They are not an official partner of MCC, but they are friends of MCC and of our partners, and they are great resources for MCC in terms of peaceful resistance to injustice. They are a Palestinian Christian family living under threats and oppression. The farm is located in a region of the West Bank known as Area C. The entire West Bank and Gaza have been occupied militarily by Israel since 1967. And as the years have gone by, more and more land within the occupied territories has been expropriated by Israel under Israelis in the term of settlements. So under the Oslo Peace Accords of 1995, Area C was created in the West Bank as land totally under Israeli and military control, civilian and military control, until the time the Palestinian Authority was ready to govern. Area C consists of 60% of the West Bank, and it was meant to be a temporary arrangement. However, since the signing of the Oslo agreements, and to this day, there has been an unending influx of Israeli settlement construction, separating Palestinian farmers from their land and encroaching on their natural resources. So in 1991, the Israeli government tried to claim the Nasser farm as state land, but the Nasser family had refused to give up their land, and for which the family still has the original deed granted under the Ottoman Empire in 1916. This has led to a 26-year court battle. In the meantime, Israeli settlements encroach on the land, blocking access points, bulldozing trees, cutting off access to water, demolishing new structures. Yet the Nassers have refused to react violently and have refused to be enemies of the settlers. The Nassers have made their farm into a meeting place for locals and internationals. They call it Tent of Nations, as a place to plant, learn, teach, and promote reconciliation across ethnic, national, and religious divides. Amal is one of 8 siblings of Bishara Nasser, whose father bought the land in 1916. The everyday resistance is a family affair, including Amal and her brothers and sisters and children, i.e. this is not specifically a story about women peace builders, more about a family of peace builders. When I was visiting the farm in May, we actually met with David, which is Amal's brother. Yet, in a new education and advocacy campaign on Palestine and Israel that MCC has launched called A Cry for Home, MCC decided to highlight Amal's voice and let her speak for the family. As a woman and a member of the family, Amal is one of the important voices proclaiming the story and mission of her family, to fight for justice and peace through carrying on with the family's work on their lands and by refusing to react out of anger and violence despite the constant and acute injustices. But that's all I'll say about Amal. I'll let her speak for herself. I just have a short video. Where's your mouse?
My father had a dream before he died in 1976 to devote part of his land as a meeting point between locals and internationals. We are here on a hilltop, and we are surrounded by 5 Israeli settlements, and they are taking our natural resources. This is my home, our roots on this land. Even under all these pressures and difficulties, obstacles, no, I will never ever think to leave this land. It's easy to get frustrated. People ask what you do now after all this destruction. We say, still, the plan is there. We want to replant a new tree, and as Christians, we believe that we don't want to repay evil with evil, but evil with good. So we act positively and planting new trees. We say we are not leaving and we are not reacting. We want to go forward, continue our work, acting in a positive way, looking forward for a better situation. Every time we feel ourselves that we fell down, again we say, we pray that God give us the strength to stand up again. Still we say, we have to follow the footsteps of Christ. We have to love our enemy. We have refused to be enemies. We are depending on really 3 basic things, on faith, hope, and love, to continue our struggle on this piece of land.
That is the mall. How are we doing for time?
Good job.
I'll come in terms of what we've got to be bold moving forward. Just to kind of to tie in some of these stories with some of the policy work that is going on. So as I said, MCC's role in Ottawa is to bring the voices of our partners in our communications with government and Canadian constituents, and the policies that are impacting our program around the world. So, in terms of the Canadian government, this spring, Nobel Peace Prize laureate and honorary Canadian citizen Malala Yousafzai addressed the Canadian Parliament, calling for Canada to take the lead in terms of promoting education and human rights for women and girls. That same day, another Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Leme Gogwe from Liberia, made a similar call at an event my colleague and I were able to attend, capitalizing on Malala's message and challenging the government. She says, there are 10,000 Malalas out there at the grassroots. We just need to find them. So let me tell you, the time is ripe in the Canadian policy context to talk about women, peace, and security, and supporting women-led organizations and the projects that I've been talking about tonight. Just share a little bit about some of the work going on in the last 3 months. So as I mentioned, the Women, Peace and Security resolution passed at the UN 1325 16 years ago. So it required all states to take a national action plan in terms of how to address this policy. So the prevention, protection, relief and recovery and participation of women involved in terms of conflict. So as part, so Canada had developed that plan in 2010 after a lot of pressure. The previous government launched the plan. The reports were overall good, but critics still felt that the issue was not really incorporated. It was kind of a side issue for the government. So outsiders are calling it to be a central issue in this next plan going forward. So in March 2016, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs launched a study on the new plan. And so in October 2016, the committee released their report of all the findings, calling for Canada, for women, peace and security to be at the core of Canadian foreign policy, at the very core, in terms of international assistance in all its forms. So in this past April, we were able to gather with people from Global Affairs, National Defense, and other government departments to talk about what this plan will look like in the future. So at the same, but however, no budget has been allocated for this kind of plan. So, and however, so in June 2017, the government launched their new foreign policy, calling it the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So it was a policy highly anticipated by Canadian civil society organizations, and came after consultations last year. So it contained a lot of buzzwords like feminist and women and girls and grassroots organizations and climate change and the SDGs and peace and security, supporting the most vulnerable, evidence-based. It all came out in Minister Bibo's presentation. You can see her at the bottom there. There were a few funds promised with that, including saying that 15% of bilateral aid going forward is going to support gender-based violence in women's organizations, and a $150 million fund over 5 years to support small and medium-sized organizations like the kind that advertised here. And the upward goal was to have 90% of bilateral aid somehow touching on gender equality. But overall, it still hasn't amounted to too much money. So for now, civil society groups like us will be watching in the coming months, how is this policy and the rhetoric going to be implemented? I.e., we want a roadmap, and where is the rest of the money? So that will be something in the budget next year. So that's enough of politics, though. Get to the end. So in the meantime, our task is clear. We continue learning, telling our stories, spreading the word, standing in solidarity, and with the peace builders around the world, especially making the case for women peace builders from the grassroots all the way up to negotiating tables.
Thank you.
I think you're in the camera.
I have to stay in the camera. Hello. We have a reception. I should have mentioned earlier. There's a reception down the hall in room 225 on the phone, but we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll move the other rest of the discussion in a few minutes down the hall to that reception. Are there any questions? Sarah.
So I teach Berkshire University, and I'm sitting here thinking about the women and girls that I teach, none of whom, thankfully, experience the same things as the women you've introduced us to. So what do we do with this, those of us who sit in these privileged positions and teach students who have an immense amount of privilege? What do we do with this? I'm already like writing down all these stories to take to them and talk with them about, but what do we do with this? How do we harness the power that the women and girls have that we have in our classrooms to act for change in ways that will help these women and girls?
I mean, one way is to get involved in some kind of organization or movement or campaign that's beyond yourself. In Canada, I mean, earlier this year, I wrote a paper on, I think I have a blog post I can send it to, but it was on the women's peace and security policy, but then it was looking at the flaws within Canada that still haven't been addressed, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, the cases that came out in the RCMP this past couple of years, military, and so addressing these issues that still exist in Canada, as one way, but also so like there's lots of movements. I know the Sisters in Spirit, which is a movement related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, was going has regular marches. I think they were marching last week. So just to get in, like to kind of keep your eyes open for these campaigns, to get involved, to volunteer. I'm a big advocate for. My first overseas trip was to Kenya in 2002, and yeah, I haven't really looked back since. So it's just in terms of having that, and I treasure so much this interactions that we've had with these peace builders from around the world. I get to meet so many great people, and so it's yeah. If there's any opportunity to get involved, and like even just and one thing that I don't think I brought you with me actually for our office, but one of the quotes we really like is talking about we're not a voice for the voiceless, but we lend our privilege as a megaphone. So even in telling a lot of these stories throughout communities and to spread the word and to kind of tell a different story about, so like for example, the Nigeria story, all we hear about, I mean, it's tragic, the horrible actions of Boko Haram and the missing girls, but our news doesn't focus on the kind of Christian-Muslim bridge building that's going on in terms of, and that women are taking a lead in that, and Muslim women, and so it's that kind of, that narrative that's not being told. Also just like, well, I remember this story, I was attending a webinar on Christianity and feminism, which is a whole other topic. Anyway, I love it. Yeah. Anyway, so it's but one of the women was sharing stories about in the time of the suffragettes. So women still had no place in leadership in the churches, and so except Sunday school for some reason, like they can work with impressionable minds. But so then they would take that time and talk about gender equality and principles of the suffragettes within that space. So it's kind of like the sewing circles. Like it's this women can be in this space, and then look what happens when you So I guess it's kind of taking advantage of your privilege and find ways to share these stories. Thank you.
Right.
I was really interested in your peace clubs. Are you aware of other countries that have these, and is there any equivalent in Canada that you know of? Or?
There are, so the founder of our peace clubs is, I think the organization is just called Peace Clubs. It's in Zambia, and so they developed a curriculum, and I can find that curriculum online. I know there's a lot of teachers in the room, and so they developed the curriculum, and then that curriculum has been sent. I think it's mostly in Africa, but there are at least 13 of our countries that have taken on the Peace Club, and they take the curriculum and they adjust it for the specific context that they're in, and so they can make those adjustments. And I know that there's a few projects. I met some folks from Laos that were in Canada a couple years ago that were also working on a very similar one. So and actually the Peace Club's founder, he was doing a master's at Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, and so he's been working a lot with Ontario school boards now in terms of developing the curriculum for Canadian schools, because it's not just about like macro level peace talks, but a lot of it is interpersonal and dealing with so in Nigeria, a lot of Muslim and Christian. South Sudan, you're getting a larger mix of different people, and so talking about how to deal with, and we've heard lots of stories of students, like I remember in Nigeria there was a fight between two students and the parents were getting involved, and other students intervened and stopped the parents from acting out violently because of what they learned in the Peace Club. So it's a great tool that we have. It's just you can't really measure, but you can see things like this and know that it has a big impact.
Kathy, I'm going to tell you. You're going to thank yourself.
Yes.
This is our dean, Kathy Winston.
Rebekah, I just want to take a minute to thank you so much for sharing your really interesting experiences with us and really showing us how you can take those and bring them into a community-based level around the world. It's not just other places. So thank you. And this is a small theater. Oh, remembrance of your experience. Should my work. Yeah, hang it in your office. Yeah, thank you so much.
225 is just at the end of the hall, to your left. So,
Yeah, yeah.
Never stops. Either we stop.